Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Show Me the Meaning, Wisecracks movie podcast that explores the deeper meaning behind the movies we love. I'm your co-host Raymond Creamer. As always, co-host Austin Hayden. How's it going, Austin?
Hello. I'm well. I'm well. You're looking like you got some green mood lighting going on over there. What's happening in
This is the
LA?
thing. I don't have a lot of lights in my apartment, and the ones that I do have, like this one that's behind me, uh, they're behind me, so they're not gonna help us.
Hey, I thought
Like,
backlighting isn't that
turn
a
it on,
good
just use some
thing?
ambient light. Yeah, if you want me to be silhouetted, I could do an episode where I'm all silhouetted. This is what I thought about Gladiator II.
Yeah.
Yeah, protecting
Listen,
my identity.
before
Um,
before we get into Gladiator, I just want to talk. I want to basically what I want to do is I want to hijack this episode and talk about Oliver
right?
Reed and the Devils. Um,
Hell
and
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. There's no chance they're gonna let us do a Devil's episode, so
yeah,
why
we're
not?
not gonna be able to do a
Why not
Devils
just do
episode.
one and call it Gladiator II?
Oliver Reed. Okay, so here's the thing. He's not in Gladiator 2, right? So for people wondering, Oliver Reed is
No,
not in Gladiator 2.
he's barely in Gladiator One because he.
He
I
passed
don't
away.
know. I don't want to steal your thunder if you wanted to tell this story,
No,
but
no, no. Go
he
ahead.
died
Yeah.
during production of Gladiator.
And they had to actually rewrite some of the story actually
Yeah,
to kind of give it
and
Jaimin Hunsu a little bit more of a role, which actually I think actually really kind of like helps the story, to be honest.
yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if you don't know, you don't really detect it. But I also, if I recall correctly, there's also some kind of early, like, CGI hijinks to kind of
Yes.
complete some scenes that were otherwise
Yes.
incomplete, and like body doubling and using, voice doubles for dialogue where he's off screen. Like, I feel like they did still have to. It wasn't just that they sort of rewrote things for Jaimon Hunsu and to kind of like rebalance stuff, but I'm pretty sure like even individual scenes weren't finished that they had to go in and kind of cobble together with a the footage that they had and b a little bit of CGI and stuff like that. So early example of that type of thing.
Yeah, and obviously we still have some housekeeping stuff to chat about, but I wanted to just get this out of the way because I rewatched Gladiator 1 last night because I saw Gladiator
Mhm.
2 in theaters 2 weeks ago. And
Okay.
Oliver Reed is one of the most captivating, but I feel like
Yeah.
underappreciated actors of last century, and we don't talk about him enough. And I just want to say for people out there that are listening, if you want to see one of the most batshit crazy movies of all time, please watch Ken Russell's The Devils. Not only is it batshit crazy, and not only is it a film of its time in the sense that it's like, post like what is it like spirit like what is it the dawning of the age of Aquarius type of film.
Sure.
It is very much heretical and very fascinating, and I actually think it's brilliant and amazing and fucked up in all of the great ways that is possible when you think about fucked up films. But go see The Devils, please. Oliver Reed is in it, and it's one of my favorite movies actually. And yeah, yeah, he's just so captivating, and I feel
That
like a lot of people don't talk about him.
very Austin thing for that to be one of your favorite movies. It is an incredible film. It's a movie that's hard to watch. Warner Brothers owns the copyright for it, and they, for a number of reasons, but chiefly the fact that the movie's extremely transgressive, like even by today's standards, um, they just don't want it out there. They don't want to be associated with it. There was so much blowback toward the film when it first came out. And every once in a while, it sort of sneaks out. Like it was playing on the Criterion channel for like half a year, maybe a couple years ago. And it's been a little bit more active. It's kind of popped its head out of the ground a few more frequently in the last few years than it had in the last like few decades.
Mm.
So it can be difficult to see, but I imagine it's one of those movies that like because of its legacy and because it has this kind of almost mythic quality as one of the great unwatchable movies, you can probably just go to Pirate Bay, type in Ken Russell, The Devils, and find a copy of it that way. And once again, we've talked about this, I think, on Cinemathology that, like, I'm a filmmaker. Far be it from me to encourage people to like pirate movies or whatever. But when a movie like that is
Mm,
A, 50 plus years old, and B, the people who own it are deliberately keeping it away from folks who want to see it, just steal the movie. Steal it. Go out, pirate a copy,
mm,
show it to your friends, because it's a movie that watching with a group is outstanding. Like, if you're not gonna
yeah.
be able to watch it in theaters, because Lord knows Warner Brothers would definitely never allow people to do rep screenings of it. But get some folks together if you can find a good transfer of it online. And one last thing I'll say about the depth one last thing I'll say about Oliver Reed is that it's a movie that has this reputation for being totally insane. And it's the rare film that when you watch it, you're like, oh, no one oversold this. In fact, it is perhaps undersold. Like it feels I remember the first time I saw it feeling like it's like a Hieronymus Bosch painting come to life.
Mm.
It's truly outstanding. Oliver Reed is extraordinary in it. Um, and one more note on Oliver Reed, because I guess we're just doing Oliver Reed appreciation. Burnt Offering's really good. Check that one out. I was just having a conversation with my cinematographer about Oliver Reed because he is quite fond of the Richard Lester Musketeers movies,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I was listening to an interview with a fight choreographer who had been asked like who's the all-time great on-screen swordsman, and he was like, in terms of technique it would probably be Basil Rathbone, but in terms of like fighting the way that people actually used to fight, where they're just using the sword like a fucking club and swinging it and just like battering people into a corner, it's Oliver Reed.
Oh,
and,
that's awesome.
and if you watch the Three Musketeers, there's a great bout between him and Christopher Lee, where
Mm.
there's an interview with Christopher Lee where even he's about like fighting Oliver Reed was terrifying. It's like, he goes like 100% on every single take. And,
Mm,
you know, you see Christopher Lee gets into this whole thing of like, you see a lot of sword fights in movies where people are clearly doing choreography. It's too graceful, it's too clean. And it never felt like choreography with Oliver Reed. Like he's actually trying to kill you. He's selling the moment like he's that committed to it.
mm.
So kind of an interesting figure in film
Yeah.
history. Not all the stories about him are great, but he was a great actor, and um, you know, I guess like not to be glib or whatever, but he kind of died doing what he loved, which was drinking on the set of a movie. So, like, I guess there are worse ways to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, cool. So do we have any
so a little bit
housekeeping
more
that we gotta do?
housekeeping. Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
what do
gonna
we got?
say before we get back into or before we jump into Gladiator 2 in earnest, just want to give folks ahead. We have a letterboxed SMTM pod. We post kind of little capsule reviews there. You can also follow me on Letterboxd. I'm at Crematoria. And send any emails for the show, mailbag, questions, comments, maybe not criticisms. we we hear enough of them from the
Oh
top
my gosh.
brass at Wisecrack. Um, but if you want to write into the show, weigh in, or if you have a question for the mailbag, that's at wisecrack.smtm@gmail.com, and we will dip into that mailbag in future episodes.
Oh, yeah.
Um, anything else? Oh, the last episode, on Hughes Showdown, Breakfast Club versus Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Uh, our producer Matt Keebler. Matt, you told me we have a result on this. Do you want to jump on and update the listeners?
Yeah. I figured. I'm
Bre-
curious then
Breakfast Club
because
won the community poll, but I think Planes, Trains, and Automobiles won the live poll. But there
yeah,
were
which
there
is
were more
interesting.
votes for Breakfast Club overall with the two of them combined.
That it makes me wonder then I wish we could do a sociological study on the breakdown of the
Folks who
live
listen live
listeners.
are Planes,
That's
Trains
right.
fans.
Who are you? Yeah, who are you? Please name yourself,
And the
explain your
YouTube community
choice.
is just much more emotional
Yeah, yeah.
and moody like the Breakfast Club team.
Yeah, we wanna know. Give us your answers and your justification in the comments, whether it's in the community poll or whether it's in the video. Let us know, even in this video, I don't care. We don't care where we find the comments. Let us know your thoughts.
There you go. Breakfast Club is being ushered through the gates of Valhalla, right up
Figured.
there with The Substance and John Carpenter's Halloween, the the big three. Um,
That's what's gonna be so
no
funny.
canon is complete without them.
The SMTM canon is gonna be this strange selection of films from these random battles that we do or these random episodes that we do, which is why I do think that every quarter we need to go back, or maybe every 2 months, we need to then decide which one of the episodes that from the standard episodes that we do, which film is the one that we usher upwards. Like, maybe we do another poll or something like
Again,
that?
I feel like the only problem with that is that we have a tendency for every one movie that we cover on this show that is from more than a decade ago, we'll say we cover three that are from like this year or last year. You know what I mean? Like
Well, we
the
can
we've
canonize
we've done
recent films. Do you I mean, no one's gonna fucking vote
well,
for
but no, but what
Gladiator
I'm like
2.
the substance. But here's the thing: the substance was voted in. I'm not saying we can't canonize recent. I'm just saying that the canon will take on a very it will have a recency bias kind of baked
Yeah.
into it if we're dipping into that pool over and over and over again. Which is why I think we, at least for now, we have to keep on kind of like curating things a little bit just to kind of spread things out so it's not like
Okay.
90% movies that came out in the 2020s just because that's what we tend to cover more recent stuff because
Add the
it's
devils add the
better for
devils to the
the
canon.
SEO and what have you.
The
Put the
devils is
devils
in
in
the
the
canon.
movie that no one can watch and vote on. We're just cramming it in there.
New people will come to our letterboxd and they'll be like, "The Substance, Halloween, Breakfast Club, and The Devils." That's our 4.
Yeah, we should put out a poll that's really stacking the deck and be like, the Devils versus, I guess Gladiator
Sallow.
2. And
Oh,
just,
no.
yeah. No, I was gonna say just make
Oh,
make it a cakewalk for the Devils, but I guess maybe I'm tipping my hand a little bit too much about my feelings about Gladiator 2.
The Devils
Um,
versus, Babe: Life in the City, or whatever the sequel
Babe
was
Pig in the
called.
City.
Pig
Hey,
in the
it
City,
has
that's
its
it.
defenders. Um, okay, so that's it. Housekeeping out of the way. Gladiator 2. Before we get into this, a little synopsis, catching you up on. First of all, obviously, there's going to be some spoilers in this. We'll probably also talk a little bit about Gladiator 1, so if you haven't seen either of these movies and you care about spoilers, give them a watch before you carry on with this conversation. But Gladiator 2 picks up what, like 15, 16 years after the first one, I think. And the little boy from the first one, Lucius, is a hunk now, and he's like backpacking around Africa, kind of trying to find himself. And then the Roman Empire comes a calling, and Pedro Pascal shoots Paul Mescal's wife with an arrow and takes Paul Mescal and other survivors as slaves back to Rome. And then Gladiator 1 happens, basically. Like, Paul Mescal kind of fights his way to a higher status in the Colosseum, all while kind of trying to maintain some proximity to the object of his vengeful desires, which is Pedro Pascal. Wants to avenge his dead wife. All very familiar if you've seen Gladiator 1. Meanwhile, Denzel Washington, kind of playing the Oliver Reed role, is a slave owner who buys Paul Mescal, and he is using his bravado in the Colosseum to kind of further his own goals of creating rifts in Roman society to eventually topple the empire. Because as we find out, he too is a former slave who just wants to see the entire empire crumble. Uh, Connie Nielsen rounds out the cast. So that's kind of where. Oh, and then there are two
Emperors? Yeah, yeah.
emperors. Yeah, one of whom is syphilitic and kind of losing his mind. Um, and they're sort of the Joaquin Phoenix role together, just very capricious. Um, yeah, that's basically it. That sort of those are all the pieces that you need to know that are put in place for all of the palace intrigue that unfolds. But again, if you've seen the first Gladiator, it kind of unfolds in a pretty similar fashion. Um, there's some big fights in the Colosseum, some wheeling and
Sharks,
dealing behind the
sharks,
scenes,
and
some
some
sharks.
sharks. Which
This is
interesting. I want to
let's
talk
talk
about
about
the
let's talk
sharks.
about the sharks because this is something I remember. I remember back in school reading. You read those little like Snapple facts about history, where you'll be
Yeah,
reading about the Roman Empire or whatever, and then just to make sure the kids are awake, they'll throw in a little thing like there were even some naval battles that were staged in the Colosseum, and they would flood
yeah,
it and da 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 da. Like that actually does have some historical precedent. And I remember reading that as a
yeah,
kid and being like, that kicks ass. Like,
yeah.
like reading that and having seen Gladiator, I remember. So a little bit about the first Gladiator. My friend Jimmy Kirk and I, in I'm trying to think of what year it would have been that Gladiator had just come out. About a year after that, when it was playing on TV and stuff, we did a project. We were studying the Roman Empire and reading about the Colosseum and stuff. And he and I did a project where we made the Colosseum out of Legos and we
Mm,
recreated several tableaus that were
awesome.
kind of like some of which were inspired by because we were just like watching Gladiator in the background while we were working on this,
That's so
leading up
sick.
to our
Yeah.
big presentation. So I do have some fond memories of the first one, but I haven't seen it in maybe I think I rewatched it maybe a few years ago.
Mm,
Um and I like the first one fine. It's a perfectly good kind of pulpy slice of historical fiction. But I've always thought that that movie was not necessarily overrated, but that people maybe take it a little bit more seriously than they should.
mm.
Like, I think that there's a bit in The Sopranos where Joe Pantoliano's character is constantly quoting Gladiator because that's like the big Italian pride movie that came out at that moment. And it's such a good bit in in that show because it like fully captures a type of guy.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah, yeah.
like an Italian dude who is all in on Gladiator. Like just
Who
loves to
wants to?
see.
Who wants Rome to conquer the world again?
Yeah, I remember this happened with 300 as well. I was working in a record store in high school when 300 came out on DVD, and I was like the movie guy at the record store. And we had a big 300 display when that movie came out. And there was one customer who came in, saw the 300 display, and immediately lost his mind. He was like, "Oh my God, 300, that's my movie." And then he started quoting at full voice, quoting lines from
Yeah,
300, but
yeah.
not the lines that you would think. He wasn't like, "This is Sparta." He was like, "Careful, even a king's messenger is held accountable." Like in Sparta, like he would just do like like fucking exposition from 300,
That's
and
so good.
he rattled off like two or three big lines that had no like cinematic quality to it, were just pure exposition. He was like, "That's my movie," and then he grabbed a copy and came up and bought it. He was so happy to get a copy of 300. Um, so yeah, like a certain type of guy who loves Gladiator. I think this is another reason why like the Shawshank Redemption is always near the top of the IMDb top
Mm,
250
mm.
of like for a certain type of viewer, and I don't say this with any criticism or judgment or whatever, but folks who maybe don't watch a ton of movies and then they see a movie that is kind of like has mainstream sensibilities but is clearly a cut above the rest, something like a
Mm.
Shawshank or a Gladiator. To them, that is like, you know,
Yeah.
height of cinema. It's like maybe the biggest or most ambitious, artistically ambitious movie that they've seen in a decade or something like that. So it makes a certain sense that a movie like Gladiator just kind of was huge when it came out, like was big hit,
Mm.
won a bunch of Oscars. Um, and then when you watch this movie, whatever my feelings toward Gladiator 1, which are mostly just like, yeah, good movie, but I don't really like think about it. I think the title of this episode on YouTube was something like "Was Gladiator 2 worth the wait?" And I was like, I think that's a misleading title because I don't feel like anyone was waiting. Like I don't, like it doesn't feel like no finally we have the conclusion of the story that already ended. Like it's just one of those things that I remember maybe 2 years ago, Ridley Scott was like, "Yeah, I'm working on Gladiator 2," and everyone's like, "Oh, okay, cool." Like, and this movie to me kind of feels like I could imagine doing you could do I didn't think it would be a direct sequel to the first one. To me, it felt like, "Oh, he's gonna make another movie that is in the same milieu, that is kind of about this era, this moment, this place, but not like rehashing and like retconning aspects of the first one. Like this movie's
Mm,
so tied to the first one in a way that I just did not
mhm.
anticipate. And
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
that's
well,
kind of to its detriment.
yeah, well, I mean, so the script was in development for like 20 years. Many different rewrites, many different people involved in the rewrites. And I think you can clearly tell when you're watching the film that it's passed through a lot of hands. There's a lot of stuff that it tries to cover. It's not as tight or as succinct or as simple even as the first one, which is a very kind of really tight revenge narrative that then has these really, like, lovely flourishes about this this man trying to reach his family in the afterlife and the kind of mythology and, the relationship with Jamin Hunsu that kind of, like, really feeds
I
that.
think
There's this really interesting, like, spirituality, I think, in the first one that the second one, it's got those, like, kind of like the afterlife sequences and whatnot, but I think it really misses the transcendence of the first one and so it's not as tight, and I think it's a little bit more kind of a little bit all over the place, and in that sense, so you can tell that this was a film that was in the cooker for a very long time, and that a lot of different hands kind of had their mitts on it.
yeah, and I think that you bring up a good point about the first one that I think is one of the reasons that it is to the extent that it's successful and has endured. I mean, this movie's actually doing pretty well at the box office. Like there is a
I
lot of
said,
goodwill
remember
toward
last
that
week
first film.
I said people are going to see it. It's going to make a lot of
Yeah,
money.
people will go.
Yeah.
And I think that first film, one of the things that it does well is what you're saying of like it's a very simple, kind of straightforward revenge narrative of the, for lack of a better word, the more like the artsy kind of flourishes are sort of layered on top of that. And it's well made, well acted. Um, it's just really good, like meat and potatoes.
Yes.
And this is a movie that I think I want to be clear. Like, I don't think this movie is like terrible, but it's a movie that feels so kind of chained to the first one in a
Mm.
way that begs the question of like, why bother? And I get that, the obvious answer can always be, well, there's money to be made. Anytime you have a
Yeah.
successful IP, you want to sequelize it. There's gold in their hills, whatever. But like, why, why 20 years? Like
Yeah.
if it's going to be this, if it's going to be this indebted to the first one, it's not like Clint Eastwood buying the rights to Unforgiven and then sitting on them for 15 years until he had aged into the role of William Money. Like you're gonna recast Lucius anyway. What was it? What was it that made them feel no? Like we gotta really get this right. Like because
Yeah.
in my mind, I can imagine a version of this movie coming out 10 years ago that is no better or worse than this one, and that's kind of what confused me a little bit about it coming away from it was like to the extent that anyone was waiting for this are you left with that notion that like yeah it was worth revisiting this is there anything that's being
Yeah.
built on or that's being like are there new ideas that are being introduced that are even
Well,
compelling because to
let
me
me
it
let
just
me say,
kind of
yeah.
felt a little rehashy.
I think there's a cultural and socio-political explanation for this, and I don't even know if this is conscious, but, sometimes the zeitgeist, for lack of a better term, kind of dictates the context out of which our art emerges. Not sometimes, always, but sometimes it has a really heavy hand in it. And living in a post 2016, post Brexit, so that's post Trump, post Brexit, um, post a
Post-Trump
bunch of other things,
and
immigration,
pre-Trump.
things like that in Europe, yada yada yada. There's this sense in which people are trying to, I think, rethink this conception of how history moves forward. Like the kind of progressive narrative is that the arc of history bends towards justice. There's this idea that there's this linear progression, and that the kind of horizons are better just on the other
We
side of
talked
the
about this a
hill.
little bit on Zone of Interest.
Right, and then I think there's also this whole idea of the end of history that kind of had been played out, in the previous decades, and then now people are like, well, maybe it's not the end of history. Maybe there's, kind of returns, and there's this like cyclical thing that people are struggling with. I think of Gladiator 2 just from a thematic perspective, like what's the designing principle behind it. I think of it as being a story that's basically like, hey, Gladiator 1 is about returning an empire back to the people. It's a political statement on the value of democracy. And Marcus Aurelius, stands as this figure who is wise, who's a philosopher, remember, as well, which is really important. And even Joaquin Phoenix kind of like critiques his father's philosophies after he kills him in the first one, right? There's something about the wise philosopher, the philosopher king, who wants to give the kingdom to Maximus, not because he wants Maximus to rule, but because he wants Maximus to be a placeholder who's going to have integrity and virtue, the virtues that Aurelius says that his son Commodus does not have. And he's going to give it to Maximus so that Maximus can then return it to the Senate, so that the Senate, who are democratically elected, can be the more accurate representatives of the people. So then the question is, as the film ends with, you know, the kind of the legacy of Marcus Aurelius seemingly having life breathed into it. So then the question is great, do we live in a world where, tyrants and emperors aren't going to run amok, but things can be returned to the people? And I think historically now in real life, not in gladiator world, we're also running into that question. Who's in control of empire in the world? And I think maybe that's why now is the time to make Gladiator 2, because it's the same thing. Emperors are back. They've taken power away from the Senate, from the people. The Senate don't have power. They have to creep around in underground tunnels to try to figure out a coup to remove the corrupt, crazy, also unvirtuous rulers, right? They're not Marcus Aurelius. They're not even Commodus. They're kind of like, one is fucking literally has syphilitic brain and is kind of degrading mentally. The other is like this power hungry, more like the Commodus character from Gladiator 1. But then again, the struggle is similar. How do we arrest power from the tyrants and give it back to the people? So I think that's why now. I think that's why
There
it was made now.
there is an interesting notion that the movie gestures toward, but I do not think ever substantively engages with, which I'm not necessarily faulting it for that. I don't expect it to do this because this is like a giant expensive piece of like corporate art. Um, but there are several moments throughout the film in which they gesture toward that question of like, can the empire be redeemed?
Mm,
There is. It's funny that you say this because this was absolutely on my notes as well.
mm,
This is a movie that feels very much like it was made before Donald Trump was reelected president, and then,
mm.
of course, was released right after he was reelected president.
Mm.
The movie essentially ends with Paul Mescal telling two warring parties who are about to destroy each other. He goes, "Hey guys, you know what?
And we all just get along.
Let's just get along, work together, trade our swords for plowshares, and we can rebuild this thing."
That's right.
And it's just one of those things. I was sitting in the
And and and
audience.
and we can redeem the image that supposedly this empire was built on, which is
Sure.
very much America loves to think of itself as if only we could just get it right, then the dream of America would be perfect, you know? So,
Yes. And
yeah.
I I was sitting in the theater, like, dry heaving into my popcorn bucket during that scene, and all I could think about was, like, the last push of the Kamala Harris campaign was these
Mm,
commercials that were narrated by George Clooney of, like, very obviously MAGA coded people going into the ballot box and, like, solemnly nodding at each other, like, I think even in one of the commercials, the guys are going in and they're, like, slapping each other on the back and they go, "Hey, you ready to go and make America great again?" It's like I think they even say that outright in one of them, or something like it. And then when they get into the ballot box, the one guy, like, looks over to his daughter and thinks to himself, "You know what? I am gonna make America great again," and then he fills in Kamala Harris instead of Donald Trump. And then George Clooney's voice comes in and says, like, "It's your vote. Don't tell anyone. But you don't ever have to tell anyone what you did in there." And
so you can still tell your buddies that you voted for the other
yeah,
guy.
yeah, of course I will.
That's so
And
funny.
I just remember watching those commercials and being like, "Oh, Trump's gonna win."
Yeah.
Because the entire appeal of the Kamala Harris campaign down the home stretch was just like, "Hey, here's my friend Liz Cheney. Here's my friend Dick Cheney. Like, I can be a better Republican than this guy." And watching this movie, I just got that. I got the same kind of goose flesh on my neck of just like, "No, no, no, we can be like the good empire." Like,
Mm,
we're, it's the meme of like the fucking airplane dropping bombs on people, and then right next to it is the same airplane dropping the same bombs, but they all have like the pride flag and like Black Lives
mm,
Matter
mm.
posted on it. Um, and yeah, I just this film occasionally brings up this notion of like, can the empire be redeemed?
Yeah.
And to me, it's one of those things of like, at a certain point, it's almost a ship of Theseus thing of like, for the empire to redeem itself, it has to cease being an empire. Like, it can no longer be this it can't exist in both buckets at once, right? It has to dissolve and dismantle itself. Like, power has to be reallocated, wealth has to be reallocated, you know. And I think that was something that I found just so particularly nauseating, especially in the wake of the last
Mm.
election, just because it is like, what the fuck? What do we think was gonna happen? Like, you just can't be a good empire. You just can't. It's in the Last Jedi, or what's it? What is it? Is that the eighth one, the Ryan Johnson one?
Yeah.
Or yeah, the Last Jedi. There's a moment near the end of it where Kylo Ren says to Daisy Ridley, like, "Hey, fuck this. Like, let's try and do this the right
Oh,
way.
yeah.
Let's try and do this
Yeah, yeah,
together." And for a brief moment, like, and this is not me back, like, I like The Last Jedi, but in that moment, there is the potential for a ninth movie that is actually something different than what we've seen in a lot of other Star Wars movies, of just like, you know, let these kids give it the old college try. And
yeah.
then
Mm.
what brings them, to opposite sides of the force again is the fact that, like, you know, Daisy Ridley realizes too late that, like, no, I got in bed with a fucking sociopath. Like, this
Yeah.
can only end one way. Like, the empire's gonna empire.
Mm, mm.
And I think that's the same sort of tension with this movie, is that, like, it gestures toward these interesting ideas, but I think, maybe that's 20 years of screenwriting of, like, recognizing eventually that, like, well, that's a dead end, or that, trying to take the plot in that direction would open things up too much. We wouldn't be able to resolve it in one sequel or whatever. And so the movie just kind of ends up being this sort of like wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed, like, I live for vengeance.
Centrist,
I want to
kind of
kill Pedro
centrist
Pascal.
liberal. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but as soon as I look in Pedro Pascal's dreamy eyes, I realize, like, you know what? Our moms have the same name or whatever the Batman versus Superman thing. Like, it's just it's resolved that easily. And it's just that of like it cannot pick a lane. It can't fucking commit to what it's doing. There is a thing that I like in the movie. I think Paul Mescal's terribly miscast in this film,
Mm.
but I do like their idea of this character of someone who has like he has no grace. He has no interest in the politics of it all. If he dies, he's going to die on his fucking feet. He doesn't really care if this ruins him, spiritually, emotionally, physically, everything. He is single-mindedly pursuing, his vengeance toward Pedro Pascal, so much so that during like the big boat scene in the Colosseum, at one point, despite the fact that there's all this mayhem going on around him, he sees an opportunity where like someone drops a crossbow in front of him
Oh, yeah.
and he grabs it, aims it at Pedro Pascal, and he shoots a shot. Like he's not waiting. He's not waiting for the perfect moment to have like his duel in the sun or whatever. Like I
Mm.
love that the guy is just single-mindedly, whatever chance he gets, by hook or by crook, even if it's through subterfuge, he just wants this fucking guy dead. And then the movie just lets that go as soon as it's narratively inconvenient. And so it's just that, like, the movie just has no fucking conviction, and just
Mm.
over and over, it puts
There
these
there
more
is
interesting ideas in front of you, and then it just refuses to engage with them in any meaningful way.
there is something interesting, I think, though, with the Pascal and, and Pascal and Mescal tension there where where Mescal's he wants revenge, but once he finds out that the person he wants revenge on, when that person is also trying to undermine the empire, that's an interesting tension that they didn't lean in enough into, I think, because
Yeah,
we don't get enough information between Paul Mescal and between Pascal where they can communicate that, where it's like, "Hey, man, I know you're trying to fucking kill me. I feel horrible that I killed your wife too. I didn't wanna fucking conquer these lands. I don't like
yeah,
what I'm doing anymore. I see a different vision for Rome as well." And we don't have that moment because we only have the Connie Britton relate or Connie Nielsen, I'm sorry, relationship with Paul Mescal. And so we don't really get that, whereas I feel like that would have been an interesting kind of thing to explore a little
yes,
bit
there's
more.
that dramatic irony of, like, we know that they are both nominally aimed in the same direction, at least with regards to their, you know, sympathies about like, they both believe in sort of a version of the same idea. But once again, you're 100% right. The movie doesn't allow anything productive with that to happen. Like, I love the notion that this guy, who he is single-mindedly bent on killing, is actually an ally, and if he had found that out way sooner in the movie, that would be really interesting tension
That's
of
right.
just like, "Hey, man, like, we may be trying to work together to get this thing across the finish line, but, like, I've still got a target on your back." Like,
That's right,
we're
and here's the thing, is that doesn't mean that, like, somehow they, like, shake hands and it becomes like a buddy cop movie or something like that, the 2
yeah,
guys who are the outlaws that take down the empire. No, I actually think it's really beautiful in a dramatic sense that Pedro Pascal still dies for the sins of serving the empire. Because it's not enough to just simply argue, "Oh, I was doing my duty." The film does have this sense of justice that it's like, "No, there's a cosmic justice. You still must pay for your sins," kind of thing. So he still could die in that, but it just creates something else, like these other layers of possible tension. And to be honest, I just think that Pedro Pascal was a little bit underused in this film. I think
okay.
he's so fantastic, and I think that that storyline to me is just a little bit more interesting than the actually you're the love child of Maximus kind of storyline, which is just a
And
little
was that
less.
you've watched Gladiator 1 more recently. Is that a whole retcon for this movie? I because I don't
It
remember that being even, like, hinted at in the first one, unless that was just something that went over my head or I'm not
It is
remembering.
very, very subtly hinted at. There are timelines that are noticed where, like, where Maximus is like, "Oh, I have a son that's this age," and Connie Nielsen goes, "Oh, and I have a son that's this age." And there's a sense where they kind of, like, linger over it for a minute that they had this tryst back in the
Mm.
day before, and that so it's very subtle. I wondered that too, and because my memory before I had rewatched Gladiator last night was that I didn't think that that was a thing at all. I just thought that the kid Lucius just looked up to him and was like, "Oh, what a brave hero for the future of Rome."
Yeah,
I didn't think at
which
all that there's subtle hints in the
to
original.
me, it's more dramatically interesting that if this is just a kid who looked up to a gladiator, then like once this comes back to the Star Wars
Agreed.
thing of just like the only fucking people who can save this universe have to come from this one tree, this one family tree.
The
Um,
bloodline. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so I was like scrambling my brain during Gladiator 2 trying to remember. What fucking thing was in there? I don't remember. Um, so I agree with you, Pedro Pascal. Basically, everyone in this movie is more or less underserved. I think Pedro Pascal is kind of underserved by the script. Connie Nielsen is sort of underserved by the script. I think Paul Mescal's kind of miscast, like I said, and I think Denzel Washington comes out clean. I think he's having a
Denzel
great
Washington's
time.
in another movie. He's
Yeah,
he's he's
he's
doing
having a blast.
he's having a great fucking time.
And
And
he's
yeah,
very good in the film.
yeah.
I mentioned to Brenda when I think I can't remember what we went to, whatever it was that the Gladiator 2 trailer showed in front of, and we saw it, and she likes the first one well enough. And when we were leaving the theater, I was kind of like, "Oh, Gladiator 2 looks kind of fun. Maybe we should check that out." And she was like, "Gladiator plus Denzel, like what's not to like?"
Yeah.
It's just.
Yeah.
And then I remember the whole ride home. Like once again, cannot remember what movie it was, but the whole ride home, we were playing a game where we tried to think of a movie that would not be improved by the presence of Denzel Washington, and we simply could not think of one. um, but all that to say, he's great. He's doing his thing, and the script at least it may not be like reinventing the wheel or whatever, but he knows his place in this puzzle, and there's a little bit of nuance to his character that there's the late reveal that like, oh no, I'm not trying to run this place, I'm trying to destroy it. And he tells Connie Nielsen at the last moment, he like shows the brand of the empire on his chest. He's like, no, I was enslaved and I vowed that I would take this whole fucking thing down. And in this moment you get this great contrast of just like, oh, that's I would much rather watch that movie. Like,
Mm.
because you find out that like the only difference between him and Lucius is that Lucius is just not aiming high enough.
Oh my
Lucius
god,
wants to
think about
kill one
this.
guy.
What about this trio of or even the 4, because you have the Connie Nielsen character that's trying to preserve, to bring back the vision of Marcus Aurelius. You've got Paul Mescal and you've got Pedro Pascal who are trying to fight for something else, and then you've got Denzel who's trying to tear it all down, but by getting power so that he that's a really interesting kind of, like, four-part tension right there. That then, of course, the Senate can have its place, and the old emperors can have their place, and the battlefield has it, or like the arena has its place. But that's a really interesting dramatic tension right there. And I think they were trying to get at that, but for some reason, it feels a little bit underbaked.
A little bit. I think the movie would need to be longer. It would need to be like rebalanced. But it also it's one of those things of like not that the movie has to endorse one character over the other because certainly they all have they're all complicated people. But by the end of the movie, when it's like, no, aren't you glad that Paul Mescal won the fight against Denzel Washington? Like, I don't know, really. Like, I mean, like he had some points. Like, there's that kind of tension in the film as well that it comes back to that sort of central conflict that the movie that it's the circle the movie can't square is just that like it wants you to be invested in the maintenance of empire, and I'm not. And
Mm.
and I'm not even talking about that
But
in the broader,
most
like,
audiences, I think it's going to unconsciously resonate with them, even if they can't put their finger on it, because I think a lot of people do they believe in the thing, whether it's the American dream or whether it's the kind of, you know, the resurrection of whatever their cultural background is to like to not just not a supremacy, but to kind of like a pristine condition where it could actually just be but be good this time. And I think a lot of people will resonate with that. And I think that's why this film, like when the film ended, like I will say this, I actually had fun watching it because I was like front row watching it on a big fucking massive screen, and it felt like a blockbuster, like a summer blockbuster film, which was fun for me. I had fun, but my wife turned to me and she wasn't as into the film at all. Like she was kind of like, "Meh," and I was kind of like, hey, I thought it was fine. I thought it was fine,
I can
and
always count on Sean to have my back.
yeah, 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 and I thought it was fine, and my first takeaway was this is gonna make a lot of money, and the reason was because it's a lot of action sequences, a lot of like big, charismatic, pretty personalities, huge set pieces, and it does a lot of the fan service for like like you're talking about retconning the first one,
Yes.
but also I think thematically, I do think that people are gonna vibe with it. Now, I'm not saying that I love this movie, but I'm thinking just from a cultural perspective, I think that people are gonna really be like, they're gonna see something in it that they find value in, and I think that final sequence where Paul Mescal is appealing to these 2 armies, that was actually my wife was like, "Why did the movie end on that? He should have been standing on top of the arch declaring it," and I was like, "But that's the point." The point was is that it's not about the single man, it's about the vision. And the vision of Rome, Marcus Aurelius's vision of Rome is bigger than any one person or any army or anything like that. And she was like, "Yeah, but it just didn't have the power and the gravitas." And I was like, "I get it. I totally get it." But I'm thinking from a story perspective, I know why they didn't shoot it that way. I know why they didn't do it that way. I know why Mescal is a little underplaying that moment. Whereas Russell Crowe, when you watch Gladiator, we were just watching it last night too, like that motherfucker, that's a movie star. Like,
He's in there. Yeah.
that that time period of him in that character and the power, like, that is it is big, and it is
There
powerful, and there's something electric about it, and that's just different
Yeah,
from what they're doing in this
it's
one.
it's that movie star thing of, like, you can never really define what the it factor is, but I think when now I know memory is imperfect, but when I think of Russell Crowe's big sort of reveal when Joaquin
When he
Phoenix
takes
comes into Coliseum and he takes the helmet
dude,
off and he says, "My name
chills.
is,
Still.
Russell Crowe and, father to a murdered son and blah, 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 blah." Like,
Yeah.
I can, like, when I conjure the image of that moment in my head, I can feel his posture. I can feel his, like, the way that he's oriented, his physiognomy, the way that he's just radiating this fucking hate toward Joaquin Phoenix. Like,
Yeah.
there's just an energy that is just pulsing off of him in that moment. It's not the only moment in that film or Russell Crowe's career, certainly. But this is, and I don't mean to be ungenerous to Paul Mescal, because is it Mescal?
Yeah.
Because from what I understand, he's a fine actor. I haven't really seen him in other stuff. I think it's one of those
And
cases.
loved After Sun. I know you didn't like it so much, but I fucking
I,
loved
di-
After Sun.
I didn't care for After Sun, but I didn't think I didn't watch it and think like, oh, that's poorly performed or whatever. It just, I wasn't really vibing with the movie itself, but I thought he's very good in it. I think that's the
Yeah.
only other thing I've seen him in, though, and it feels very much to me like a case of an actor who is really good at not just one type of thing, but he has a certain sensitivity. He's good at that sort of bottled emotional stuff. Like, and then this entire movie, they're like, characters are describing him as though it's a completely different person playing the role. Like, there are
Mm.
multiple. What's the line in Gangs of New York when Daniel Day Lewis says to Leonardo DiCaprio something like, "Oh, you've got a murderous streak in you, and I like it," and you're like, "Really?" Like, because I think Leonardo's fine in that movie, but it's not. you don't 100% see in him what Bill the Butcher sees in him in that moment.
Mm.
And there are like 3 moments exactly like that in Gladiator II where, like, Denzel says something like, "God, you're just,
Rage. You've
you're
got that
rage personified,"
rage.
and then it
Yeah.
just cuts to, like, Paul Mescal sitting on a booth or on a bench just like, "Oh, okay, sure.
Well,
Why
I was
not?"
trying to figure this out last night, and I don't know if it's a generational thing. I teach acting, and so I love to also think about the theory of acting. And I've talked about this a lot with actors and students over the past few years, and there's a shift in acting style and acting performance that has taken place. There always are shifts, right?
Yeah, of
There's
course.
like the kind of like classical forms, and then there's like, the method that was so important in like the 20th century. Well, now there's like this emphasis on like being and presence and like you are the character, and it's about like accessing certain parts of you that you can enhance and that you share in like full vulnerability and stuff like that. And so I wonder if like a Russell Crowe in 2000, or even like just Russell Crowe even today, if there's just something different about like the artist's consciousness that that creates a different type of presence for this type of role than somebody like Paul Mescal, who is a 21st century guy, who has a little bit more maybe would have been socialized in a different context, Not
And
that
this
like
is his first really big movie, right? Like, has he done anything else like this at all?
it'd been more like indie, yeah, indie films, like
Yeah.
smaller indie character studies, like deep character. I know he's done a lot of theater, in training and stuff like that growing up, and then obviously when he was at uni studying and afterwards. But like there's just something about like a certain type of softness that I think characterizes so much of the like so much of actors today. And I think I love it. I
There's a
love
sensitivity, a more internal kind. Yeah.
you're more yes, it's more internal. And it's more like a receivership rather than like a doing. Whereas when you look at like a Denzel, like he obviously is full and like technically he's a phenomenal actor, but he's doing things. Russell Crowe is on top of it. He's doing, right? Now, that can be bad, like it can be pushed and it can be forced. Neither of them are doing that in any of the things that we've talked about. But but I think when it's done well, when it's done right by these really strong actors of maybe of a previous generation, um, they they have a certain strength in their kind of doingness, whatever that doingness is, that it just feels very different from a lot of actors today. And I do wonder if Paul Mescal is kind of, if that's part of the reason why, because I've seen a lot of chatter about this. A lot of people aren't as um, they're not as enthusiastic about his performance, and of course, they're comparing him to Russell Crowe and stuff like that, which is kind of always unfair too.
Yeah,
But I think
but
it's also
also
because they want something.
the
Yeah, go
script
ahead.
doesn't do him any favors in that. Like, the script is comparing him to Russell Crowe. Like, they literally make him put on Russell Crowe's armor in the film,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
which
yeah,
is why
that's
it
true.
comes back to that thing of, like,
And
I
he's the
feel as
son.
though.
He's the son, yeah,
Sure.
so
Yeah, I guess he is now. But I don't necessarily like, look, he's a hunk. He bulked up for the role. He's looking good at swinging a sword out there. I don't think he's the wrong choice for a Gladiator sequel. But this comes back to that thing of like tying this one so directly to the first one and casting
yes, yeah,
him
yeah, that's it.
so distinctly in the shadow of Russell Crowe is just not doing him any favors. Not only because Russell Crowe's a great actor, I think Paul Mescal is a great actor as well, or at least from what I've seen, I think he's a capable actor. But it's just like this would be like there's a reason in Top Gun Maverick at the end Tom Cruise goes, "No, all you movie stars who I was hiring to replace me, you can't do this. I'm just gonna do it
I'm gonna
again."
do it.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
it's that thing of like, it's not just that Russell Crowe was like a uniquely skilled actor. Like, he's a great actor, but this is kind of the iconic Russell Crowe role.
yeah,
And putting any actor in that shadow is such a disservice to that actor. I honestly think even it would be 10% better if they just cut the thing about him being his son. and this character could just have been influenced by Russell Crowe, because then that plays into the notion of just like, no, I'll never be a gladiator like him. I admire him, I draw inspiration, I draw strength from him, but like I know my place in this world. I'm not so ambitious to think that I could take down the emperor or topple the empire. Like I really just I really just want to get back at this guy who did me wrong, and this is my one chance to do it. Like even just creating that little bit of separation between him and Russell Crowe, I think would do some favors to the actor and the film as a whole. Um,
Mm,
but it just is. It's one of those things where it's like it's not just that Russell Crowe was great. It's like this is the iconic Russell Crowe role.
totally.
Um, and then the rest of the movie kind of does that stuff. It does like the fussy boys who are running the show. They're very clear. They're like very much in the same mode as like the Faye Joaquin Phoenix thing. Like I said, Denzel kind of gets off a little bit cleaner, A, because he's Denzel Washington, maybe the greatest screen actor of all time, and B, the person who nominally filled that role died halfway into production in the first one, so like there's less of an emphasis on the Oliver Reed thing in the first one. So yeah, I don't know. That to me is why maybe my big takeaway from this is like it's very easy to watch this and be like, yeah, the movie should have mainly been about Denzel and all of his kind of machinations. Like, but also at least that would just be something different, even if it wouldn't necessarily be better than the first one. It would still feel like we were getting a different flavor of this world.
Mm, mm. Have you ever been to Rome?
I've never left North America. I've only left the country like twice. I've been to Canada like twice. And
Okay.
even then I popped in Toronto when I was really little, and then I went again when I was in high school for like a day. Um, so I've never, other than that, I've never left the country. It's one of my major blind spots is that I've never really traveled anywhere.
So, my wife and I went to Rome a couple years ago on our little Italian trip that we took, and we went to the Colosseum.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to kind of bring this back to something we were talking about before when we were talking about like the sharks and stuff like that. The Colosseum is remarkable. Like it is a remarkable like it feels like some I mean, I guess it is. It feels like it's something out of a storybook. When you go there, not only the size and the scale of it, but also the stuff they're unearthing all around, modern day Rome. You are walking through thousands of years of history, and it is overpowering, and add to that the size and the scale of some of these architectural buildings. It is really almost feels otherworldly, and it's crazy that actually that is our world. Like, that's our fucking world, but it feels like you're on another planet or something like that, you know? And, we had a really lovely time walking around the Colosseum, and I remember one of the things just standing there and just thinking about this circle as being this icon that represents the empire, and that it was used for entertainment, but also for punishment, and to also for storytelling and cultural reinforcement to get people to buy in. And I remember them telling us that they would fill it with water. And you can see in the Colosseum, you can see like the ground level where the actual gladiators would have fought. And then there's also like the below area where they would have been waiting or where animals would have been kept
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And to then think that they would fill this fucking thing with water, like, again, it just makes it seem even more insane. And the reason I bring this up is, one, is because it's a truly tremendous thing to stand in the presence of that. But also something that this film, I feel like, didn't quite give me was that sense of grandeur. Was that sense of, this is a place that is like representative of an empirical or not empirical, an imperial march to literally spread out over the entire planet. And you feel that when you're there, Like, you feel like,
Sure.
"Oh, this is like a single thing, but that represents the world, or at least their effort to control the world." But I didn't quite feel that with this film,
Yeah.
whereas in the first one, I do a little bit more. I did
It's
feel the scope a little bit more.
you you bring up an interesting thing that it's like Ozymandias, right? Gaze upon my works, ye mighty in despair, and the statue is like crumbling. That you can see the entire history of this empire in a single image of
Mm,
like you said, the decadence, the grandeur, now reduced to essentially rubble. I mean, more than rubble, but you get what I'm saying.
yeah, yeah.
It's these structures are decaying. It's the natural order of the world. I think there's something interesting and instructive about that. It is like it's illustrative of mythology, right? This is the Tower of Babel. Like it's uh, uh, not just a monument to this once great empire, great as in large, but it's also a monument to the hubris and the pride of humanity,
Mm,
something that is perhaps endemic to humanity. um, I've been thinking a lot lately, mainly not mainly, but in sort of conjunction with our zone of interest episode, about how all history is a fabrication.
mm,
Like insofar as the only manner in which we can experience it is through storytelling, is through, you know, you can read something, you can read things that are carbon dated, that are factual, et cetera, but your conception of it is still going to be a product of imagination, either yours or someone else's. Ridley Scott, maybe. This is something that I think a lot about. I'm obsessed with ghost stories, and one of the things that fascinates me is that our conception of ghosts today is that they're like floating and translucent, and you can walk right through them. If you read early ghost stories, that's not how they were described. They're described as like flesh and bone, and right in front of you there are several ghost stories in which they will just like grab you or punch you or scream at you, but they largely interact with the world in much the same way that humans do. It wasn't until photography was invented and hucksters started doing like death photos where they would do like double exposures to make dead relatives look like they were sort of hovering, all sort of translucent in the picture, that our conception of ghosts started to become that. One of the many reasons we know ghosts aren't real is because everyone who claims to have seen one claims to have seen the ones that have only existed since cameras were invented.
mm,
Um and it's just one of those things that I think so much about, just how technology and narrative really shape and instruct our view of history. That I mentioned on Zone of Interest how we often think of history as this fixed object, that it is not a collection of historical context and personal agency and choices being made by humans in positions of power, misbegotten or not. It is just a thing that happened because it had to, because it's inevitable. And we could no sooner change it in the moment than we could change it now, you know? And I think when it comes to a movie like this, comparing it specifically to the first one, because you can't help but compare it. I have been thinking about it in the context of that, of like, does the first one better capture the essence of Rome, whatever that might mean? or was it just the first major mainstream conception of that place in that time that you were exposed to? And now, 20 years later, it's no longer like the first one, we're going to build half the Colosseum. And they were like shooting footage and having to flip it in post
Mm,
so that they could make it look like they had a second, a second half of it completed behind them.
yeah.
And so, like, Russell Crowe was having to fight with his left hand for certain takes because they knew they were going to reverse it in post. Just little things like that, where so much care and attention to detail went into building some facsimile of this thing as it was at that time, or at least as it can be imagined to have been,
Mm,
as opposed to now where it's like a little bit more reliant on CGI. There's
yeah.
a little less fixation on blending the seams. I think back on that first movie because so much of this film begs the comparison because so much of it is like even just beat for beat doing the same stuff as the first one. The first movie, when they have that big reveal of the tiger leaping out of
Mm,
the ground and trying to snatch the boy. And then in this movie, there's a version of that with like a bunch of CGI apes just fucking
yeah.
going crazy on like, and it's just stuff like that where it's like, well, this just feels perfunctory, and it
Mm.
it no longer has the capacity to surprise. And when they do come out, it no longer has the tension of like, oh my god, Russell Crowe's it seems to be on set with a live animal that could conceivably actually fuck him up.
That's what I was
So
gonna the thing with the sharks kinda threw me off because not that I know that they filled the Colosseum with water, but would they have been able to capture fucking great white sharks? Like, is that
I don't
historically
know.
accurate?
I don't
And
know if
and
that might be. I was wondering the same thing. I should have looked that up
and to be
if there's
honest,
anything to suggest that.
they didn't
They
look
didn't
that
look
great.
great. But I'm
Yeah,
also not like I'm not here like we could nitpick that. There's a lot of day for night in this movie that does not look good at all. And I think a lot of that has to do with Ridley Scott not wanting to be working past like 9 p.m. like just there's just little things like that where it's maybe a little bit easier to cut corners now. Um,
yeah.
there's
And
just
again,
less and less of an emphasis of
I like fantasy. Like, this is film that we're talking about. It doesn't have to be real, but the only reason I mention it is that Rome already feels otherworldly. Like, the Colosseum being rebuilt and having these fucking warriors battle, and then you just flood it with water and redo a naval like, that's already like, I don't think you need to
yeah, it kicks
add the
ass.
sharks.
I
It
think the
kicks
sharks are kind
ass.
of a hat on a hat. It's one
Yeah,
of those things that
exactly.
reminds me of like, have you seen Sergeant York?
No.
Okay, it's a movie that's based on the exploits of an actual World War II veteran.
Okay.
And let me make sure I'm thinking of the right one because I might be thinking of the wrong one. Um, yeah, Alvin York, Sergeant York, 1941 movie starring Gary
Okay.
Cooper. Um, I think this is the movie that I'm thinking of where they had to take some stuff out of the actual story about the guy and like his acts of heroism on the European front because they were like, if we put that in the movie, people will think we're exaggerating. They'll think
Yeah,
that it's like
yeah,
fake. And it just turns
yeah,
out like no, this guy was just like he was just metal. Like he
yeah,
did some stuff that you would not believe if Gary Cooper was doing it.
yeah,
And uh, you know, to justify that labored comparison, it's one of those things where I'm like, even if the sharks were a thing in the Colosseum, which they might have been, I mean, those fucking guys were crazy. Like, they did some wild shit back then, as evidenced by these two movies. It's one of those things that is just kind of a distraction, and it doesn't give the
yeah.
movie the tension that it's intended to give because it's like, well, they're very obviously CGI, and also they're not gonna put one of the guys that is on the marquee in the water. Like we're not worried about all the extras getting like knocked off the boat and ripped to shreds by the sharks or whatever. Like so at a certain point, it's just like, no, the spectacle is enough. Like the boats
Mm.
fucking wailing on each other. Have you ever seen 'cause here's the thing. Apologies to folks out there if this is not a very substantive conversation. I just don't think it's a very substantive movie. And I find I find that we've been talking a lot about like other better movies that this reminds us of. Um have you seen The Vikings with Kirk Douglas?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that movie kicks ass. Great Richard Fleischer movie. And they shot it in like a fjord in Iceland. And they have these like real longboats that are coming into this harbor. And there's a scene near the beginning of the movie where like these guys are coming home from doing whatever Vikings do, nothing good. And as they're approaching the harbor, there's a bunch of people who are sat out like doing laundry and things like that, and they see the long ships coming in and they all start waving. And the guys on the ship, Kirk Douglas included, start running across the oars. And they're just like kind of playing, just
Awesome.
doing it sort of gleefully. And it is incredible. It's just
Mm.
like this real ship with real actors floating across real water in front of these beautiful glacial mountains, and you're seeing something real. And it doesn't
Mm.
matter that there's no tension, there's no stakes. Like, it's these guys enjoying a real human moment. And when you're looking at it, you could imagine, like, there's no doubt in my mind that maybe, people from all different cultures of all different eras had senses of humor. There's no doubt in my mind that this might be capturing a real moment that actually happened of these guys coming back to safe harbor, and they're so happy about it they're celebrating by
Mm.
jumping from oar to oar out, you know on the
Over the
water. And
water. Yeah.
it's just an exquisite moment. It's so cinematic, and there's no life or death, there's nothing blah 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 blah. And I'm sat there watching these fucking ships trading paint in the Coliseum the other night and just thinking to myself like, there's no grandeur. There's no there's no there's no glory to be won by sitting in like a water tank in front of a green screen and rocking back and forth like this. And then
Mm.
like, okay, now Paul, this is the part where you pick up the crossbow
Well, and
and
that's the
you
whole
aim it
point
over there and you shoot.
is that scene is meant to serve to give us the moment that he can pick up the crossbow and that he can target Pedro. So it feels very instrumental. So it's like, cool, we know what the point is that they're trying to drive to in the scene, which is they just need to create an opportunity for that story beat to be hit. But then everything else feels very instrumental. And then someone was like, ooh, it'd be cool if we added this, and it'd be cool if we added this, and it'd be cool if we added this. So I know. I do want to say real quick, we've got a couple chat things that we do want to get
I
to.
was about to throw to the
So
chat.
we got a super chat from Dude Abides.
Up, dude.
Dude said that he is refusing the Glicked movement in favor of the Wikiator movement.
So
So
this is another thing.
instead of Glicked, it's Wikiator, which I've not seen Wicked yet. So I've only eatored or
Right.
gold. So I haven't
Glad two
gotten to the
aters.
Icked. Yeah.
I
Or whoa.
there was a moment where, because we always try to plan like a month ahead of like, oh, what's going to be a big movie and da 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 da, what should we go see? And there was a moment where Matt, I think you had thrown out Wicked as a possibility because like there's no use denying it. It's a big hit, but I think anyone who has been paying attention in the last month, like you can't leave the house, at least not here, without running into a Wicked advertisement. You can't watch a YouTube video without being served some Wicked ads. Like the full court press on publicity for that movie has been
Big P&A
everywhere.
spend for Wicked.
Huge spend for that movie. And people are digging it. And I'm glad they're digging it. It's the same. I think Hollywood would love to have another Barbenheimer moment. I don't see that happening, at least not with this twofer. Although Wicked may go the distance, I mean, it's doing really well. It might hit $1 billion. I don't think Gladiator is going to have those kind of legs, although it is doing very well. Um,
Oppenheimer didn't pass like 500 mil, did it? It was like
no, no, it was very close to $1 billion. It was like
Oppenheimer was?
it was
Oh my god.
900 and change, and there was all this talk about, like, maybe they'll do a re-release because getting a movie like that across 1 billion is one of those things that almost just
Oh,
feels like
wow,
a
yeah.
challenge.
Yeah,
But no,
it is.
it did an insane amount of money, especially for a movie that is, like, admittedly not it's not exactly I don't think anyone, even the most optimistic, box office guessers would have assumed that it would get that close to $1 billion. I think the most optimistic people probably thought it would top out around, maybe it'll do 200, 300 million.
That's what I thought
Um,
for some I think I was only thinking of the domestic, which is like 330, but yeah, it did like 970 something,
and there's
975.
no doubt that the Barbenheimer phenomenon, like, I don't think if Oppenheimer had just come out as like it's a new movie from Christopher Nolan, I'm sure it would have done well. Um, there's no doubt that in my mind, that it would not have gotten near 1 billion without that kind of cultural phenomenon pushing it. Like, it became such a big thing to get your friends together and go see a little double feature. Um, I think it's great. I will say, whatever my feeling, like, I'm not gonna see Wicked just because I can't stand that show, and I'm just not interested. It's just not my thing. Um, One thing I will say though is that, like, to the extent that there has been like a Blicked or Wikiator movement, I am somewhat relieved that there has not been like a desperate attempt to like market it as such. Where I remember after Barbenheimer, everyone was trying to get Saw Patrol going, and by everyone I mean the people who produced Saw X and Paw Patrol. um, but I don't feel like Glicked has been pushed in my face by anybody. It doesn't feel like anyone's tried to manufacture that or anything. I think it is just kind of similar to what made Barbenheimer a phenomenon. Is like, yes, there were the memes and stuff like that, but more than anything, people were just excited to go to those movies, and they just so happened to come out at the same time. And I think that is like, I know that everyone in the city is so allergic to learning the right lessons. Extent to which Glicked is a thing, I think it is maybe it's less attributable to marketing and more attributable to the fact that, like, no, people want to go and see movies that are well made and that are nominally aimed at adults. That's the one thing I'll say for Gladiator 2 is that, like, I may not have been crazy about this movie, but it was absolutely a cut above your average kind of sequel, remake, whatever.
Totally.
Like, it's a movie that could have been a whole lot worse. There were
Mm.
some little technical nitpicks that I gestured toward, of just like, maybe a little too much CGI, maybe a little too much day for night. But at the end of the day, like, it's well acted. It's well crafted for the most part. It's thoughtfully made. I you know I would so
Again,
much
it's one of those
rather
ones
watch a
I'd
movie like that
yes.
than, yeah.
Yeah, we'd rather have these out there in the world than a lot of the other stuff that maybe doesn't, have some of the more kind of interesting features. And even though
Yeah,
thematically you were saying you don't know that this film, I do think there's something interesting to say about Empire and what's our position on Empire and why now? Why 20 years later is this film finally getting greenlit?
yeah,
And sometimes it's not even a conscious decision that we make. It's not like the studio execs are like, well, in a world where Empire is crumbling, or people are asking about crumbling Empire and the status of the kind of the world history. Let's greenlight this project. No, but
yes.
it just appeals to us at that kind of like instinctual animal brain level.
Sometimes a
And
moment
yeah,
chooses a movie,
yeah,
and I can imagine that sort of being in the water right now, even if people aren't really articulating it or aren't really thinking about it so much. But I
yeah,
do know the extent to which it kind of hit me while I was watching the movie was just like my basic revulsion at the notion that, like, this is a movie about how the empire can turn things around. And I'm just like,
yeah.
fundamentally that's kind of a conservative notion, and I just don't fucking need it, man. Like,
Yeah.
you can keep that shit.
So a couple other things in the chat. So actually, our number one fan, my wife, Sean, was out at lunch, but she watches all of our live streams. And so she
As you know.
texted me.
Oh,
Yes, she does. Um, she texted me and she said, "Hey, people are asking in the chat. So this is thank you, baby, for letting us know, and for you in the chats, you can
yes,
also
thank you,
thank her
baby.
for bumping your comments. People are asking in the chats if we're ever going to cover shows like Silo or Severance. And I wanted to put this out there. I don't know if we want to kind of like start talking about this now and winding down the Gladiator talk and maybe kind of
Yeah,
maybe chat about other things, but I
we've
figured I'd
had
at
this
least mention it.
conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. We've had this conversation off mic where we've been like, obviously, in this first few months of the show coming back, we kind of wanted to find our feet, try a few new things here and there, but for the most part, like one movie, one episode, kind of trying to dig into stuff like that. But I know Michael has said he really sees Wisecrack 2 as a home for all things pop culture, that it's not just movies that we want to talk about. I don't watch a lot of TV, but if we had enough runtime, or excuse me, enough lead time, I'd be more than happy to check out a mini series here or there if there's something that people are really excited to hear us talk about. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things too where like I'm sure Michael will have a lot of thoughts on this of just even a really successful TV show may not have the same kind of like overlapping audience that would be interested in coming to listen to one movie discussion. Um,
Have you seen Severance? I know you don't watch a lot of TV, but so Severance
I
is
know that's
the type.
the Adam Scott one, right?
Yeah. And
I've
it's
heard it's
it's the type of it's really great, and it's not only is it, like, well acted and interesting and got a really cool sci-fi aspect to it,
mhm,
but it's got this really cool conceptual and thematic, element to it that really is very Wisecrack. It's very on brand for
yeah.
Wisecrack. So I could
That's
absolutely
the other thing
see
too.
that one.
I feel like we'll have more discussions about it to try and figure out the best way to approach it if we end up doing some TV stuff, because it's another one of those things of like, do we cover a season in an hour and a half? Like that feels like we'd be biting off a lot for one conversation. Maybe it's something where we do, if we're covering, I don't know how many episodes are in Severance, 10 in a season, 8, 10,
Probably something
13,
like
something
that.
like that.
Second season's coming out. Yeah.
See, that's the thing of just like as soon as the second season comes out, do we do another episode about it? Um, I could imagine us doing, if we wanted to kind of burn the midnight oil, do the regular episodes of like covering a movie a week, and then maybe like 2 times a month we also will do like, okay, we're doing these 2 episodes of Severance. We'll be back in 2 weeks with episodes 3 and 4 or something like that.
Mm,
Um, we could figure it out. And I know
yeah.
Michael was keen on talking more about how to branch things out beyond movies to do maybe even video games, in addition to
Oh, yeah.
TV. But yeah, it's just an issue of like trying to figure out what people would be interested in listening to, and also kind of trying to figure out a way for us to sync up and like, okay, we can cover these episodes, or we both have enough time to play such and such video game, or whatever the case may be. That one might be a little bit tougher, but I don't know. I
Listen,
I feel
if
like
I have to play some video games for work, then I
you'll
will,
take
yeah,
you'll take
I'll
that.
take it.
You're willing to bear that cross. Um, yeah, as we're winding down a little bit, anything else on your mind? Last thoughts on Gladiator 2 or Gladiator 1 or anything else?
No, the only thing is, yeah, I'm still glad that it exists in the world, and I'm glad that people are gonna go see a movie that, you know, it's a tough industry, and there's a lot of competition that wasn't there, in previous generations, and, as somebody who's invested in the industry, I wanna see it do well, and I want it to be healthy, and I want it to survive, and so I had fun watching this movie. Even if I didn't love it, I still got that sense that I was seeing a cinematic event. And big cinematic events are, they're they're a precious thing, and I think we kinda take that for granted because we look back historically, and there are so many great things in the archive, but to be able to go to the theater now in 2024, 2025 now coming up, right? To be able to go to the theater and have that fresh cinematic experience on a new film, it is a rarity. They only happen every once in a while. Ones that really succeed and the ones that really hit and that give you that sense of overwhelm, like you're seeing something magnificent or grand. And yeah, I want to root for that because that still is something that was really impactful for me growing up, and I think it still is something that kind of it gives us something culturally that I think is really interesting to be able to see larger than life figures and larger than life ideas and larger than life worlds play out in front of us. And so I'm pulling for those things always.
Absolutely. Likewise, I would say the exact same thing. That even if these movies aren't necessarily for me, Gladiator, I was kind of fine on. Like I said, not really interested in Wicked, but I'm rooting for them. I'm rooting for both
Yes.
of these movies, even if they're not my movie, because like whatever keeps the projectors running, whatever keeps the popcorn
Mm,
popping, as long as
that's
folks are going to the theater, you know, it does make me happy. It's exciting to see folks that are getting excited to, it has a little touch of the Barbenheimer thing of like,
mm,
there have been a lot of videos online of people going to Wicked dressed up, wanting to sing and dance in the aisles and stuff like that. Um, when a movie feels like an event, the proof is in the pudding. People want to go
true.
out and share a good time with their friends, now more than ever. Um,
That,
Speaking of, in typical Raymond fashion, uh, jujitsu this one. I think Thanksgiving's dumb. I think it sucks. It's a stupid holiday. It's a stupid idea for a holiday, and kind of problematic. But whatever. That said, I love any excuse to get together with family and friends. Love any excuse to get some rest. To yeah, to surround yourself with the people you love, the people you're grateful for, the people who give your life meaning. So, whatever your feelings about Thanksgiving, I hope you have a beautiful one out there. I hope you all get to spend it with family, with friends, with loved ones. Um,
and for our
we will be back
international audience, they don't give a shit. So fuck
for
yeah.
the international audience. Enjoy work on Thursday. um, but for our American listeners, hopefully it's a day of rest and gratitude, and not a day of arguing with your shit heel uncle. Um, we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming of 5 p.m. next Tuesday. Our run of Show Me the Meaning nights is coming to an end. So 5 p.m. Pacific next Tuesday here at Wisecrack 2, youtube.com/wisecrack, at wisecrack_2. And next week we're covering Heretic. Have you seen this, Austin? You heard
Not
about
yet.
this?
I mean, I've heard about it.
So, any thoughts on Heretic from the audience? Go out, see the movie. I guess I haven't seen it. I've seen the trailer. Hugh Grant looks like he's having fun, and we've been known to get into conversations about religion and philosophy. It looks
Love
like
it.
the movie's maybe dabbling in some of that. So we're gonna check it out, and we'll be back next Tuesday, 5 p.m. Pacific, with a conversation about Heretic. Until then, keep dreaming of a better you.